Welcome to Boroughs Burbs with hosts John Engel and Roberto Cabrera. Over the next hour, you're going to learn some insider knowledge that will help you overcome and strategize in the cutthroat world of real estate. Now, here are your hosts, John and Roberto.
Welcome, everybody. Episode 104, Waterfront Dreams. Roberto, I can't believe it's taken us 3 years to get a show done on waterfront homes. I mean, this is what everybody wants, right? This is lifestyles of the rich and famous. This is what we're all aspire to be. And it's taken us 3 years. What happened?
And I don't know why.
I don't know why. You go out to the Hamptons for it. I live in Connecticut for it. And yet, look, Scott Hobbs can't get away from it. And yet, 3 years later, here we are, episode 104, Waterfront Dreams. I want to introduce two of the best waterfront designers, Mary Burr and Ryan Salvatore of Burr Salvatore Architects. Say hello.
Hi, everyone.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thanks so much.
We're so excited to have you. And I've got Scott Hobbs to ask the really hard questions because he builds houses on the water. And so he knows enough to be dangerous. Why are we doing it now? Well, it occurs to me that waterfront has never been hotter than it is right now. We've got the $90 million waterfront sale in Darien after, 20 years of trying. Boom. This month, somebody buys $90 million of waterfront Darien. $150 million in Greenwich. Oh, my God. And, of course, you've got Shippan Point, which has been, hot for 100 years. You had a $7.5 million sale on the end of the point only probably a year ago. Reason number one, waterfront's never been hotter. And reason number two, it's hurricane season. So that's why we want to talk to the builder and the designer about the things you need to know about being on the water. So with no further ado, let me just thank our sponsor, Grace Farms, home to Design for Freedom, aiming to end forced labor and building materials for our spaces. I want you to use promo code BURBS at sharegracefarms.com for 10% off your first order of their coffees and teas. I'm going to show that on the screen right now because I am so digital. See, that's their coffees and teas. And we'd like you to support Grace Farms and Design for Freedom by going to sharegracefarms.org. And without further ado, let's get right into it. Mary Burr, Ryan, how long have you been doing this?
So as architects, we've been practicing for each of us about 10 years, although doing it together really for more like 3. We both actually met in architecture school. I was a year ahead of Mary. Then each of us went to work at Robert Stern Architects. I left, Mary left a few years later, and we teamed up in 2020.
You glossed over the best point of our meeting, though, which was I was a year behind Ryan in architecture school, and we were friends. We knew each other, but never romantic. Never was there.
We should say we're partners in life
fun.
And business. Important qualification here. Otherwise, this could sound weird.
Yeah. And then in my last year of architecture school, Ryan called from Robert Stern trying to recruit me. And I was so charmed that I said, I think I'll accept the job. And the rest was history. We only overlapped for about 6 months at Stern's office before he left. And then I stayed for another 6 years.
I should mention the educational pedigree of the two of you. You went to, Ryan went to Princeton, but you went to Williams, which makes getting into Princeton looks like you're just walking into McDonald's. And then you both go to Yale, architectural school. Is that what it takes to build on the waterfront?
No, I don't think so. I think we're both fortunate to have had those educational experiences, but clearly not. Although I do think one thing that doesn't, both of us came from liberal arts backgrounds before we went to architecture school. And I do think that sort of informs our approach to things, just an awareness outside of architecture. There's the technical demands of building on the water. And then there's also how do you capture, and this is the stuff that we think about all the time, how do you capture the spirit of living by the water? What does it mean to live by the water? Yeah, you're confronting hurricane season, you're thinking about where do you put condenser, stuff like that. But more importantly, there is a lifestyle associated with waterfront living. And how do you embed that in the architecture such that the people who live there are experiencing it day to day, moment to moment?
were you doing waterfront your entire career? I mean, were you working on this in the Stern days, or has this been only in the last
Yeah,
few years?
actually, most of the projects that I worked on, at least at Bob Stern's office, were waterfront, either on the lake. I worked on a project on Lake Michigan. It was a pretty major house that I spent about 4 years on, actually, and another project on Lake Skaneateles, upstate, Hamptons. Yeah. What about you?
I was only in Stern's office for about 18 months, and I worked for the entire time on one project. It was a house on the vineyard, not on the water, but proximate with some distant views, really special property and special house. So related, and certainly part of this whole kind of cultural movement. How do you capture the spirit of that lifestyle? And then before that, before going to architecture school, I spent about 8 years as a general contractor and did a fair number of waterfront or water proximate projects. So it was pretty familiar, certainly with a lot of the technical stuff as a result of that experience.
It's interesting because I never only think of that firm as a New York building buildings in New York.
Yeah, they have a few studios. They're divided into studios, and a few of them that just do houses. And actually, most of them are single family houses outside of the city. So that's where we cut our teeth. And I think as a result, we have a very sympathetic way of working, not just stylistically in terms of design, but also the way we run our practice. It's formulated on our experience at Bob Stern's office, where there's a great culture.
I think each of us had great experiences there. A really wonderful place to start a career, and also for the people who've spent their whole lives. I mean, the people that we day to day look up to, whether Bob or the partners that we work for. I think oftentimes we're thinking in the office, what would this person do in this situation? It's a great model and example, I think. So, real important touchstone for us.
So now we've established that the people who want to build on the water, they're buying some of the most expensive real estate in the country, really unique properties with unique challenges, and they want to hire the best. And they go to a place like Robert Stern, and they hire the best in the country. And you've been working at Stern on these. Is it located mostly in the Northeast, and is it mostly oceanfront, or have you also worked on projects both in Florida and, as you mentioned, lakeside? Have you worked all over the country, or are we talking about a concentration in the Northeast?
I think that at Stern's office, it's much more nationally and in fact internationally, and lots of different types. In our practice, it's really been much more concentrated in the Northeast, but on a variety of different sites, whether it's fronting on the Sound, whether it's fronting on the Atlantic Ocean. In fact, I'm working on projects in each location with Scott and his team, actually. So a variety of settings for the work, which is actually really exciting because each one invites a different opportunity, different design possibility.
So I think that some of the ones that were sent over that we could talk about, let me see if I can pull them up on the screen, and maybe you could walk us through what some of these are and some of the design challenges that went into them. So walk us through some of these case studies. So this first one, I believe, is in Stamford, Shippan, maybe on Shippan Point.
It is, yeah. And for really special clients, wonderful people who I think of in many ways as like the Medicis this was one of the first projects I had worked on. Interesting backstory. When I was in the construction business, I had done a gut renovation of this house for other clients. Those clients sold the house to the current owners, and when they moved in as a contractor, I had just done some superficial stuff to it, some tile, paint, whatever. Fast forward, I don't know, 3 or 4 years later, I had gone to architecture school. And it might have been right as I was leaving architecture school, I got an email from the client saying, listen, we really need a trash enclosure. Do you think this is something you could design? Of course, like every architecture student's ears are up about a trash enclosure. Could you get a more exciting project? Anyhow, I'm intentionally being sarcastic, nothing ever materialized. But so then, about 1.5 years later, I got a call, and this time Mary was still at Stern's office. I had just left. And they said they had bought the property next door, which included another main house that dated from the early 1900s, and the barn that you see on the left. And they said, we want to think of this as a family compound, a place where our 2 kids and our grandchildren can come from wherever they're living, and really, it's like the homestead for the family. And it was a really, and actually we're still, always doing small things there. Really, really fun project, right? Fabulous west-facing views on the harbor. This is the cottage building where the clients decided, you know what, we want the exterior to really be sympathetic with the rest of the house, the main house, but the interior, can we do something a little more whimsical? This is our escape to the 1950s and 60s, the mid-century world. And the client actually did all of the decorating in here fabulously with a lot of original pieces. But it really was meant to be like a retreat and almost like a folly on the property. But undergirding that was the mandate that we needed to do it. We maintained 3 separate parcels. And in order to build a pool, the city of Stamford has regulations such that you can't have an accessory structure without a principal structure. So that cottage was really a one-room apartment that satisfied the need for an accessory building. This is the barn, which dated from the 1860s. It had been elsewhere on the property originally. When we found it, it was really in shambles. I mean, it was a workshop and I'll use the word not really appealing apartment upstairs. We shaved off the west-facing elevation, introduced this entire post and beam system, and really just tried to open it up to the water views beyond. And this is a guest house for the property overall.
Did you expand this at all, or is this all within the pre-existing structure?
So all within the pre-existing structure. Actually, if anything, we carved away square footage because this front half was not open at all, 2 stories. So we opened it up as a way to develop views from the primary bedroom through the living room out to the water, because the building is oriented the wrong way in a sense. The short end fronts the water, but yet we wanted to try and capture views from as many rooms as we could. A really special project for wonderful people.
So what type of glass do you have to use that can withstand wind, that can withstand, the sunlight?
Yeah.
I guess sound isn't necessarily an issue, but I mean,
So
what sort of glass is that?
That we on that west elevation in particular, we originally started with an Italian manufacturer, triple laminated glass, and the original iteration actually had almost like a minivan door on its side. By the way, this project that's up is one that we just wrapped up with the Hobbs team. A really fabulous project, about 10 or 12 houses up the shore from the one we were just looking at. But anyhow, so all of the windows were tinted for UV protection on upholstery because they're west facing. In that particular instance, we didn't have to hurricane rate them or meet some of the standards that you might find, for example, down in Florida, Miami-Dade, but really being very much aware of sun influences and comfort, because you have to amp up HVAC. You have to think about what it's like to be in front of that window at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on a summer day. Like, there's no benefit to having glass if it's really uncomfortable to be there.
Yeah.
Here, a little bit more transitional project, not on water, but off water, inspired very much by nautical influences, but trying to do it in a way that was a little bit more innovative. So some of these rounded steel members here, there's like actually a metal cage floor of the loft to make it feel a little bit more open, but not so literal in its appropriation of nautical or maritime architecture. Trying to do it in kind of fresher, more contemporary language.
This too was a pre-existing structure or not?
No, this was a new house.
So you designed. Are there any like zoning restrictions or a style that you have to maintain, or heights? Did you have any restrictions in creating this?
Well, I remember that we needed a variance for this because it's on a corner site. And one of the hardships of being on a corner site is that you have 2 front yard setbacks. The front yard setbacks are generally deeper than side yard setbacks. But we were able to get that variance.
Yeah, I think we had a legitimate case for it. I mean, in many cases, it's not so much a local or whether regulatory or association-based guideline that drives some of our thinking about, let's say, context, but more our interest in it. Like, I think the last thing that we want is really to drive by and know that house was built in 2019. That's not to say it has to be duplicative of the context it's in, but really more like, okay, this fits in massing wise. This feels comfortable on the site. It looks like it belongs here. Like that to us, I think is kind of one of the key hallmarks of a design that's worth building. That's going to stand the test of time.
It's such a compliment when someone doesn't know if it's old or new too.
Yeah.
So generally, I was reading in one of your studies that it was something to the effect of, you were saying, you know, in building, we don't want to, because of views, we don't want to necessarily cheat any room of having some opportunity to experience that view. And the general thinking is that you would make a house that's kind of long, but you could also, I'm assuming you could also make it tall. Is there any general thinking though, that because you're on the water, because of the weather, because of the winds, that generally building high is less desirable, or there's a limitation to it, or does that matter?
Well, I would say two answers to that. One, there is a practical limitation of a building height restriction. But two, when we're building, we build in many different styles, but oftentimes on the water, we're looking to shingle style precedence. And the shingle style is known for its rambling quality. It's not super tall. In fact, oftentimes the eaves dip really low and the roof is very all encompassing. And it's kind of the opposite of these houses that you see that have been raised out of the ground artificially in order to avoid the floodplain. So I would say that was an aesthetic reason, as well as the effect that, of course, every room does want a view to the water. So you often have a single loaded corridor with all of your bedrooms along that corridor so that everyone gets a view.
I mean, if you just, the images that you just had up in the house, the back of the house with the awnings, I mean, that's a perfect case where we actually graded up to the house because we really wanted it connected to the grade. And when you think about, again, the benefits of waterfront living, like the idea that you could walk out of your house and feel connected to the shore, to the beach beyond, to just literally meander through your garden to your kayak, like all of that gets to the core of why it is so special to live on the water. Now, the exception is go out to a beach, you know, I'm thinking of Green Hill Beach or Charlestown Beach in Rhode Island, right? Those are beach cottages up on pilings. That's a different type of thing, right? But certainly in the southwestern Connecticut setting, where the houses are typically rooted in the ground, totally different approach, where you really want to feel connected to the ground plane, and we really fight in big ways to enhance that connection, rather than pushing things out of the house. And actually, you know, urbanistically, you think about places like Rowayne. Rowayne is such a fabulous place. Its density, the character of the houses. But what you see there, Old Greenwich, et cetera, is as people have to confront some of the flood regulations, the houses pop up out of the ground and it begins to compromise the wonderful streetscape. So anything we can do to mitigate that, like we go out of our way and think a lot about it.
Is there any sort of, is there a different, like the foundations of these houses? I'm assuming there's no basements. What sort of, is there anything specific that you have to do here for these houses?
On these ones that we're looking at now, in fact, this particular site, nothing specific. These were out of the flood zone. On one of the earlier ones, it's a crawl space with a little bit more robust foundation system. You can't use it for storage. The pool house on that property, I think you could probably launch a space shuttle from, because of the flood regulations mandating certain structural requirements. We're working on one right now where we have an 11-foot deep foundation with 24-inch thick slab because of risks around hydrostatic pressure, that is groundwater coming up that might push the foundation up, and also waterproofing, really sophisticated waterproofing systems right on the water. So it really depends site to site, but I think outside of certain regulations that prohibit uses in certain ways, and there are a lot of those, it's sort of the construction technology has evolved in a way such that we can sort of do anything and really use that space if the regulations will permit us.
I'm looking at the picture
and if the client
now.
has the right budget.
Yeah.
Yeah. Important consideration there.
I'm looking at the picture now and I've just noticed this very subtle fencing on the right side. And I would think that fencing is one of the most critical things you could do, both fencing between your neighbors, and in this case, the fencing on a retaining wall to meet code. But nobody likes to look at unnecessary fencing. So it strikes me that you're innovating, you and other architects are innovating with materials in ways that you couldn't do even 10 years ago.
I think no question. And I think the vendors are pushing it in a big way too. Like we constantly have vendors coming through our office, introducing us to the new things that are on the market, and like huge new opportunities as a result of that. I mean, that glass is coated with a particular film that limits how dirty it can get, so that the salt spray or whatever coming up from the water isn't a constant pain in the neck to deal with. Subtle things like that just make all the difference for the person who ends up using it.
Wow. I mean, what can I say but wow. To have to think through the details of salt spray and humidity. It also occurs to me that if you ask me to design a house, I guess my initial assumption is I take out a sheet of paper and I assume I get a nice flat piece of land. But it strikes me as I look at these images that you have very complex sets of levels that you have to raise these houses above sea level significantly, but you have to do so in an elegant way so that it's not towering over its neighbors, that it's not using fill or retaining walls in inappropriate ways and making it an awkward series of levels. So can you talk to us about, trying to site it close to the water and yet with the limitations of retaining walls and levels and stepping down?
I mean, I think the stepping down is an advantage. We always think that it's a more interesting building section when there's a series of interior terraces. And as Ryan already mentioned, we want to connect the indoors to the outdoors as much as possible. So oftentimes we end up grading up to the house.
Yeah, I mean, as I think about this image in particular, this is the backside of the cottage that the windows upstairs are looking out to the sound, but the other side is the street side, and there's a significant grade difference. And although this is a relatively tight site, it's a waterfront site, always there are limitations on area versus, for example, if we're working in backcountry Greenwich where there's a lot more space. But some of the strategies that one might encounter for a site like that, the kind of classic approach to a manor house where you weave around and you discover outbuildings on the site, or you come around a corner and the vista to the house opens up. Those same themes we were trying to use here. So the driveway comes down, and although you might glance a vista of the house off to the corner, really you're focused on the barn and the tree. You come around the corner and discover the house, and the grade is all part of that. The transformation from street, the threshold across the piers into the driveway, making one's way down, the procession, something we always talked about, whether at architecture school or Stern's office. Where is the front door? Marking where that point of entry is. And it doesn't have to be heroic. I think that comes down to style in many respects, but that one should always know how to get into the building. And that procession and sequencing is so critical to that.
And often it's a subtle signal. A lot of our clients these days want a service entrance as well as a main entrance where guests come to, and sometimes the service entrance is where they park, it's around the side where the garage is, where they will be parking daily as well. But subtle cues, like we might change from a Belgian block or a paved driveway to gravel. That signals to someone who's never been to the house before, okay, the gravel, that's more casual. That's the side entrance. The Belgian block or the brick driveway, that's the main entrance. That's the one I'm going to follow. So we think about that, and we work with landscape architects on all of these projects, on nearly all of them, I would say.
I mean, I think in this one in particular, the landscape architect was Bruce Sellers, who unfortunately passed away a few years ago, but he brilliantly developed almost a series of outdoor rooms using the grade. And so as you move down the steps and through the site, you have a different character to each of these areas. Up at the front right, there's a very formal parterre that leads you to the front door, but way down by the water is much more casual. The paving becomes more organic with moss growing up between it, and a real seaside landscape of Rosa rugosa and grasses along the seawall. That it really, the transformation from the street to the water is so complemented by the landscape design, whether here and really every one of our projects, that's the case.
One of the questions I set up before, and I want to turn this over to Scott Hobbs next and get his perspective on building on the water. But one of the questions I sent was the design trends question. And this picture I think, illustrates it well. There's a tendency to want to go traditional cottage, and yet in this photo we also see sort of the modern barn to the left with the steel roof. I guess that's a steel roof. So can you talk to us about where the trends are going? Are we getting away from traditional because we don't want to puncture a wall with windows? We want to make the wall a window. So can you talk to us about that?
Well, I don't think we're getting away from traditional. There is a big movement for this, what people call transitional. You've seen the modern farmhouse, right? You've seen the white modern farmhouse with black windows that is ubiquitous right now. And I'll confess, we did one ourselves in 2018, but that has become such an overused trend, especially in this area. And I think the perpetuation of trends is probably aggravated by everyone being on Instagram and seeing the same images. But I think that what we try to look at precedents that are not just contemporary precedents, because that endangers us to falling into that trap and following trends. But we look at a lot of earlier examples, and
I mean, you began by saying you want to make sure that when you're done, they can't tell what year the house was built. I'm wondering, did your client say to you, I want a normal looking house here. Give me a traditional looking house, but I want a lot of windows so I can look at the water, but I want a traditional looking house. And that's what you're calling transitional?
So it's interesting. I mean, one of the questions we'll often ask clients in our earliest meetings, just from a process standpoint, the first meeting we have after we've sort of been signed up, the first meeting we have with clients is really we just sit down and talk. We want to build a narrative for what this project is about. And we'll often ask clients, can you name the project? And in strange ways, that naming exercise begins to inform parts of the project in ways that you'd never imagined. So anyhow, but one of the questions we'll usually ask is, okay, on a scale of 0 to 10, 0 being the glass house and 10 being the White House, where on that spectrum do you want to be? And we feel comfortable across that spectrum. We really feel strongly about that it's not everything is a white box, not everything is a salt box, but it's really response to client desires, site, et cetera, et cetera. And what's also interesting about that is when you hear, well, a couple of things. First of all, we might be talking with clients, a husband and wife, and one says they're a 2 and the other one says an 8, and we have to figure out how to meld those two. But also, like, the person who says, I'm really an 8. I am looking for something super modern. And it turns out really what they meant is, I want a traditional white kitchen with some chrome knobs. Like how to understand what that means, modern or contemporary. It varies so much from person to person. I think though that if you look at the evolution of houses, particularly along the water, from let's say the turn of the century to the present, clearly there's been a movement to add much more glass. That's partially because the building technology has improved much more, so that glass doesn't mean drafty, glass doesn't mean leaky. There are better ways to do things now that really afford the opportunity to engage the water in the site much more, for obvious reasons. But the question is, how do you do it in a way that doesn't scream glass box, if that's not the ambition? And sometimes that is the ambition, and that's great.
All right, Scott. So when they come back and they say, I want a glass box, and the architect says, okay, I'll give you a glass box, massive glass windows. And then you say, you can't have that. Does that happen? Or what's the relationship between client, builder, and architect? And at what point do you say, no, you can't have that?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is when people start working with the architect, this is really the dream phase. And it is, as Mary and Ryan brought up, I mean, it takes most clients can't describe what they ultimately want at the first meeting. And sometimes they can't describe it by the 10th meeting. And so the architects are working through this long process, and finally you get everyone excited and you're working through the issues. And maybe at some point you talk budget, but along the way, the dream sort of took over. So unless there's a builder involved early, then sometimes the dream shows up and we get to be the wet blanket. And so there's a $5 million budget, and we do a quick takeoff. And we're like, well, I hope your budget's around 10. And that's really a big problem, because it's there's no way to reconcile those two things together unless the client really has kind of the budget is kind of irrelevant to them, but budget tends to be relevant to almost
Does
everything.
that happen because the architects aren't clued into what things cost, or because waterfront costs more to build?
I would say this is an endemic to the whole custom design process. And it's not, I wouldn't blame it on the architects. I mean, admittedly, most architects aren't as keyed into today's pricing as contractors are. For a long period of time, there's not a lot of inflation. So, if you got your last round of pricing was 2 years ago, that's great. It doesn't really matter. But like over the last 2 years, pricing has been crazy inflationary. And even guys who, you get a bid 1 month and the next month, the bid is wildly different. So you have no concept as to what's going on. That hopefully is leveled off. But I really think it's part of the dream factor that, one of our project managers once put out there that, we're not building housing. We're in the entertainment business. And in that entertainment business, it's the whole design process. It's the end product. It's how people are going to use it. This is not a four walls and a roof over your head. This is something that's exciting to do and that's exciting to live in afterwards. And that process, again, you can't stop every way along, you can't get in the way of the creative process and sit there and keep hammering away at dollars without hurting that process. Now, having a contractor involved in order to help keep everyone go, design is awesome. You guys are so excited. This looks incredibly great. Everyone realizes that we've surpassed the last budget and we're heading in a direction that's going to be more expensive. And if people like it, most of the people who can buy waterfront houses and build custom can afford to spend more if they're getting something they like. If they're not getting something they like, then why should they spend more? So it's kind of that check in between there. And that's one of the most difficult parts, because ultimately we can build anything. It just is that question as to, what are people willing to pay? And then there's a whole long process with the architect and builder and finding the best way to do it to match those the vision with what's the most practical long-term solutions at the best budgets. How do you do?
Almost always we'll say to clients in the early phases, the very early phases of the design, like before, we'll want to know big picture budget. But then we say, let's just put the budget aside for a little while. Let's draw the best possible thing we can draw for what you've told us you want. And you know what? Almost certainly we can guarantee you that this is going to be over your budget, but we'd rather put the best ideas out there and come back. And it's a grueling process to say, I love that, but it forces a certain degree of discipline from everybody on the team, whether it's us, the clients, to prioritize, like, this is the most important thing. And then, okay, we couldn't do this other thing, but there's a kernel of an idea there. And how do we do that more affordably? Or more economically, whatever the case may be.
Wait, you start with teasing me with something I can't afford.
It's like a real estate
on purpose.
Yeah, taking you to a house you can't afford.
Look, we try to do it in a way that it's not 4x what you can afford, right? But we think, and it takes a lot. Honestly, it takes a lot more effort from us, because then we're redrawing, we're redoing. But it honestly yields the best outcome, or it yields an outcome that everybody's comfortable with. It puts the client in the driver's seat to say, these are the things that are most important to me. This is where I want to focus.
And we always do more than one option for the same reason. The client usually likes A from scheme 1 and B from scheme 2, and then we Frankenstein them together to something that looks good, but includes everything they want.
Yeah, Frankenstein might not be the best verb.
I think the buying process of purchasing an apartment is completely the opposite. It's that you start at a certain place with the basics and you allow them to keep growing it, because they'll do it on their own. And they come the whole way up. If you actually let them feel, touch, and taste something that they can't afford, and then you come back down, the process also becomes depressing. Mm-hmm. So it's different. I don't know. It feels different from.
There might be a little difference here, that in a custom project, let's just say that a waterfront lot costs $5 million. And in some places it costs a lot more than that.
Sure.
And let's say you're going to build a house, and let's say that the basic house at which you'd be marginally happy is going to cost you $5 million. And then you got $2 million worth of furnishings, and you've got $1 million worth of fees. So you're in here already at $14 million, and you have a nice house. Now, if it was 15 million and you were really excited, or 16 million and you're over the moon every time you drive home, we're talking about the marginal last dollars, as opposed to on an apartment where it's like, I'm here's the budget. This is it. What I'm buying is what I'm getting. I'm not there. There's not a whole ton of the variable. And ultimately, I think even with a bunch of clients that, if somebody has a $5 million budget for their apartment and you show them a 15 million, all right, that's probably irresponsible. But if you show them a 6, people might go, it's worth it for this extra.
Of course, but they will grab it. They will do, and they start getting excited. They grow into the process. Like, now this is what I'm talking about. They keep coming, and you allow them to do it. It's also a matter of trust. We have a bad reputation. You start taking them to places, they're just like, they just want to make a commission and sell you something. And that's just not it's a process. It really is. You're getting to know people. It's a relationship. I'm sure that you guys, it's the same thing. You have the wife calling you saying, look, he's going to tell you he wants the kitchen this way. And he's going to say, don't tell her. She's going to call you this, and you're right in between.
What? What?
At what point will I know what it's going to cost me that we're going to be into this for 14, and how solid are we on that 14? I say that because I have a client in town who was going to expand their starter house, and now they're realizing that it's going to be $4 million project, and they got bummed out. They thought it was going to be a $3 million house. Now it's a $4 million house. So they went looking, and they said, you know what, we're just going to sell it and go buy ourselves a $3.5 million house. They're bummed out because prices just went up 33% when they blinked. Is that a function of the architect not setting the expectations during the process? Is that a function of where we are in the economy today? And how often is that happening these days?
So we almost always, at least for a new house, will bring the builder in pretty early on, bring a builder in, not necessarily the builder we end up using, but oftentimes it is, to do what we call gut check pricing, where they look at our fairly schematic drawings, but we'll accompany it with a written narrative saying, we're using, say, Marvin windows and cedar shingles, and give them some outline. And they can give us a budget that's probably within 20% of what the house ends up costing. But it's not until we flesh out the drawings with all of the materials and have a really developed set of drawings that they can give hard numbers to that. And even those numbers change.
But also, not to be the Grim Reaper here on Grim Reaper of architects, but this is I suspect among architects this would be an unpopular statement, but certainly in the sector of architecture where we're doing most of our work, which is the single family residential market, right? Architecture is a luxury. Custom design is a luxury. And the reality is, for most projects, somebody who hires an architect to design something specific to them, hires Hobbs to build it for them, they're not going to be in the money on the project at the end of the day. There is a certain utility that comes from the customization to it at the end product. And also, as Scott was describing, the process. This is a fun process. We say it to clients all the time. If you're not having fun in this, that's really unfortunate. We need to make it fun, because how often are you going to spend this kind of money on something? Like, think of this as the best vacation you've ever taken. And there's a certain utility to that process that has to be factored into what this cost is. It's not all about, okay, well, I put X into it, I can get Y out of it, because it just doesn't work in the custom market. And that's a tough pill to swallow.
Although it did actually work for that brief moment in COVID. I mean, anyone that built in 18, 19, 20, 21, they would have made a lot of money if they sold, but then they couldn't ever buy anything, and they certainly couldn't buy what they actually had, just created. And I think that what Ryan brings up again, the great point that, and Mary also, and that you try to set up budgets. Inherently, the system has a problem that when owners are asking contractors, what do you think this is going to cost? The contractors aren't stupid, because what do you think the owners want to hear? A high number or a low number? I mean, it's like, we just want to know the truth. And really the answer to that is like, or the question back on that is, well, when do you want to know the truth? Because if you want to know the truth today and you're going to hire the guy that tells you something lower, it's not in my best interest to tell you the truth. Now, we really try to, because we're lucky under our reputation, and we're trying to be honest with the people, and we don't like the later discussions. But we don't give a worst case scenario. I mean, it's, and quite frankly, there is no worst case pricing scenario. All of our clients can exceed our wildest expectations on pricing. I mean, you can go entirely crazy, And some people do. And by the way, if you get value from that and excites you and makes you happy, you should do that. But, ultimately the owner controls a lot of the pricing, and the selections that they make are going to drive that pricing. And if they don't know early on what they want, which most are not qualified to know, it's very hard to get the pricing correct. I use one extreme example that a client had said, we just want to do sort of French country. And it turned out they wanted Louis XVI. And it's not the same zip code. I mean, it's way off on that. So, am I wrong on my budget, or are they wrong on what they told us is for their expectations of what they wanted?
Also, then there's a question of what are you building for? Are you building for a timeline that's 25 years, that's 50 years, whatever the case may be, because that drives how things are detailed, how things are material selections that are made along the way. And all those ultimately drive the budget. And sometimes it's tough to ferret that out at the start of a project too.
So it looks like Parry lives in a lighthouse. He's asking, is waterfront land worth more than the structure at the vineyard? And I'll ask that question a different way. The example you used was $5 million piece of land, $5 million budget for the structure, plus another 14 of fees and decorating, et cetera. As the price of land, waterfront land went up, let's say from 5 to 10, or from 10 to 20, for the very best spot on the point, wherever that is, Florida, the Hamptons, wherever. As the price of land went up, did the budgets for construction and the budgets for building these houses go up proportionately?
That's a tricky one. And I'd be interested in what you guys say also. I would say, yes, a bunch of the budgets have gone up because, in Greenwich, I don't know if you can get waterfront for under 10 million. I don't know if there.
And nobody's building a $5 million house on a $10 million lot, right?
But then you get into the size of the lot, how the lot lays out. As Ryan had brought up earlier, you've got to position the right house on the lot. And so, if you have a very narrow frontage, you may only be able to get a $5 million house on this lot that makes any sort of sense.
I'm imagining Rowayton, for example, quarter-acre lots on the 5 Mile River in Rowayton. If I were to be able to find one for $5 million, would I be hard-pressed to spend more than 5 on a quarter-acre lot in Rowayton on the construction? No, I bet Mary and Ryan could do it.
Sure, we could.
Bet.
But I think it also comes down to what is the size of the lot. Meaning, if we're talking about Copper Beach Farm, right? That $138 million sale, that is largely land there. You're not spending $100 million recreating that house, whatever, however you value it. But go to Rowayton, where that gets completely rebalanced. And I think probably in most places, it's a little bit narrower of a relationship, certainly than Copper Beach Farm. That's an outlier.
But there is a peninsula in Westport, for instance, that's just been bought and subdivided, and they're talking about $10 million lots. And I think they're 2 acres. So using that as an example, you think that those clients are probably building $10 million houses on those $10 million lots because, and the outliers might go higher, but nobody's going to go lower.
I don't think so. Or if they're going lower, it's because they want a small house. At a certain point, it could be a 2,000 square foot house that has exceptional finishes. But at some point, there's a limit to how much you're going to spend. And so it's only out of choice. And you know what? They recognize that they're underbuilding for the value of the land. And you guys can probably speak better that than we can. But like you look at it and you say, okay, I have $10 million. And I think Scott was losing. I have a $10 million site. I got to build something that's commensurate with this site here. And so I think there is some pressure, so to speak, in the market in that regard.
Are there houses that you find in, and I understand the topography is different all the way down the coast, but are there houses that, for example, you would never build in Georgia that you would build in Maine and vice versa? Like we would never build this house here, and advise a client, that doesn't work here. Like all glass does not work. You can't do it.
Stylistically, I think we would like to respond to the local vernacular. So if I'm building in Maine, there's a lot of rocky outcroppings. I'm going to look at those local materials and use that. If I'm building in Newport, I'm going to use some red brick and do some shingle style that maybe harks back to the Isaac Bell house, right? I'm using examples here, but we try to be vernacular. So if I'm building in the South, I'm going to want a broad porch.
But I don't think we would ever take the position that's completely inappropriate. We might suggest, you know what, this seems a little bit out of place. Maybe there's a way to get what you're after and tone it down or whatever. But ultimately, you know, our view is we're going to put options out there. We want the client empowered. This is their house, not our house. This is about a collaboration. This is, I mentioned this about the process. And so we want them to get what they want to get out of it. We're trying to guide them, but it's up to them to pull the trigger and say, you know what, this is where I land. And this is really what I want to do. And then it's up to us to do that the best way we can, the most sensitive way.
Sure. And Scott, from a building perspective, let's just say there's in Maine, you know, they don't build like glass boxes, but someone just is diehard. They've got the money. They want a glass box up there. Are the builders capable of making that shift and doing that? Or do you got to bring builders from somewhere else who specialize in doing that?
Well, there's still a lot of learning going on in the contemporary style. And there's a lot of little details that are incredibly difficult to put together. And you know, using an old example, I mean, if you take a very tricked out Georgian with lots of moldings and all sorts of plaster and details and things everywhere to attract the eye, you can hide a lot of things in that. So, I mean, if things are a little bit out of level, things aren't quite square, things are off, you can hide things like that everywhere. If you build a truly minimalistic contemporary and you put like negative reveals of like 1/4 of an inch that follow and chase everything all around, you can't lose it anywhere. So you literally have to build the entire structure perfectly, or the interior is going to look like crap. Because if the only detail you see is a 1/4 inch line and it goes between 3/8 and an 1/8, it looks like you're a bunch of hacks in there doing it. So those levels of detail, again, and in a big old Georgia, I mean, you'd never notice. I mean, you'd hide that stuff all over the place. No one would ever find it, even if they got in there with lasers. But in this stuff, I mean, the eye would go right to it. So it's, and regardless, again, there's, you know, if the same size house is 5 million and 10 million, odds are the 10 million has much higher levels of quality, and you got to bring in the right guys to do the stuff. Contemporary does have some specialty items to it, and you don't want somebody learning. I mean, Waterfront has specialty things because there's all sorts of weather conditions and negative pressure and water that gets sucked uphill and goes against gravity and weird things like that. So you don't want somebody learning how to do waterfront on your house, and you don't want to be somebody's first contemporary house.
I have a two-part question related to some of the things Scott just talked about. Insurance. Are you looking at, when you're designing a home on the water, are you looking at what the insurance might be dictating in terms of how the house needs to be built? And are you finding currently that you're getting some roadblocks there?
So we usually will factor it in and talk to the clients early on about who their carrier is. And those carriers at this point have some pretty standard requirements that we just need to bake in. Oftentimes they're more technical in their character. You know, it's not driving, put this room there, that room here. But yeah, it's part of the dialogue for sure.
A lot of your clients probably self-insure too, right?
I'm not totally sure. I mean, we hear a lot of, you know, the AIG Private Client Group or Chubb, you know, those level of carriers that are doing stuff. But really, then there's the issue of flood insurance, right, which is a separate issue. And that's one where, you know, everybody's ambition should be to get out of the flood zone. It's better for a whole host of reasons.
Well, and that's kind of my question. Are you building homes to meet those requirements so that they can get flood insurance?
Where we can. There are some places where it's just not tenable to do it, but it's always in everybody's best advantage. And the way the regulations are written, everybody is incentivized to move toward compliance, but it's tricky to do it. It's costly, and it also can radically change the character of a house on the site, of a neighborhood, et cetera. And so there's, I think rightfully so, a lot of pushback on it. But Mary and I were just talking about the historic preservation implications of that, you know.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely. On at least in our local area, if let me get the
I mean, there's a limit on how much you can improve a property that's within the flood zone. That's like an incentive to demolish a historical structure.
There's also a lot of the high net worth underwriters are not working in row 8 right now because they don't want to take the risk anymore. So we have a lot of clients that we're having a hard time finding coverage for.
Yeah, we just had a client buying something in Tokenique, same situation, and it's actually off water, but there's wind risk. And you know, I don't know. I think doesn't mean that these properties are not going to sell, or that I hope not. I mean, I think the endurance of the lifestyle will persevere, or people are just going to pay more for their coverage.
Yep. Thank
And
you.
if you're building new, a lot of the codes take into account things such as uplift. And it drives you crazy when you're building a stone or a brick house with a slate roof on it, and we're spending $50,000 or $100,000 tying down the whole structure where you're going. I mean, we've all had the three little pigs, and it's not going to blow this house away, and yet that's what the requirements are. It does make sense, though, that I mean, like I think we in our insurance show that we talked with, you know, in Florida and other places, you sit there and you look across a whole swath of a neighborhood. And this house is fine, and that house is fine, and this house is gone, and this other one is here. The modern houses built to code, they can withstand a ton. And I mean, even down like in row 8 and after Sandy, you would go down and you see a new house that was built at 13 feet was the bottom of the joist, and next door was built at 12. At 12, it flooded right through the first floor. At 13, it got up to within about an inch underneath the joist, and you're like, well, I'll be damned. They actually know something. They got it right. I mean,
So this is an aha moment for me, because I grew up and my aunt was at 45 Rowayton Avenue in Rowayton. And like clockwork, every 5 years, the water would just go right through the living room and back out the other side. And they'd have to replace the sheetrock on this cottage. So are you as architects able to solve that? Are you able to say, well, I mean, we can only build it so much higher in the air before we get in trouble with the codes. But we've got an awesome set of pumps. It occurs to me that we have not invented the pumps that could pump Long Island Sound out of that house fast enough. So what do you do at 45 Rowayton Avenue? Because they do have a storm surge problem every couple of years.
There's not a good solution for
You
it.
raise it.
Yeah, you rate RAISE.
Yeah, not REC.
But really,
and you pick materials that can get wet and then dry off, and
Yeah.
like
Yeah, but you don't
stone.
want a living room that can get
Yeah.
wet. I mean,
but exterior
much.
materials, certainly you want to be
Yeah.
thinking about the resiliency to them, and also the code really governs a lot of this stuff too. So you know, we can take certain actions. I think from our standpoint, the bigger challenge is if you do raise it, how do you mitigate that? You know, how do you make it feel comfortable?
Can we just get a quick prediction? Because it's just, to me, it's the elephant in the room, the rising waters, et cetera, et cetera. In 50 years, these houses, of course, they're going to be still standing and resilient because they're being built so well now. But are they going to be viable houses that are going to have beachfront? Or is that all gone?
And this might be the last question. We're down to less than 2 minutes. So give us a great big crystal ball.
Every great big environmentalist has a beach house.
The hurricane of 1938 wiped out houses along the coast. And guess what? People rebuild. So you know what? Even if they don't last, I suspect 50 years or 100 years from now, people are still going to be living on the water. They might be in different houses, might be in different places. It's too compelling.
some of our clients are already trucking in the sand that they're putting on their artificial beach. So not much will change.
How expensive is that?
It's actually not that unreasonable.
Yeah, I don't know what they
It's actually really interesting science behind it. They get the grain size to match the existing sand so that it lasts longer. I mean, it's really funny stuff.
So my final question, is it a good idea to hire a husband-wife team?
Yes, absolutely. You should only hire husband-wife teams.
Yeah, my mom and dad are actually both architects, and I remember growing up under a husband-wife team. And actually, my sister and I both became architects as a result, because it is so pervasive. You know, they bring their work home with them every night, for better and for worse. But no, I really enjoy working as a husband and wife team, in part because you know that when you hire us, we are always working on your job. We don't leave it at the office at 6 p.m. But no, I think it makes for a better product as well, because you've got two pairs of eyes instead of one on everything. And we're always running by the other person, you know, I'm stuck on this detail. What would you do here? Or we've got this issue, and so it's productive.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you, Ryan. And thank you, Scott Hobbs. And thank you, Meredith. This has been a great show. Roberto,
Thanks, guys.
I love
Thank
working with you,
Unbelievable.
Roberto. Another
Loved it.
great show. 104.
Thank
In
you
the
so
can.
much, guys.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Take
Clear.
care. Bye-bye.
Great job today, everyone.